Hello, good evening, everyone. You hear me?
Good evening.
Hi, welcome. Welcome, everybody. Hi, Adolfo.
Hi.
Okay, I think we're going to begin.
Okay.
We have a beautiful round number of 100 participants. Thank everyone again for another live salon. Tonight we're proud to have with us Curator Adolfo Roitman. He's the Elizabeth and George Group Curator of the Dead Sea Scrolls and head of the Shrine of the Book. And I think that the shrine doesn't really need an introduction. From the time of its completion 55 years ago, it has become almost overnight not only home of the most important treasures of the Jewish people, and not only a powerful symbol of the Israel Museum in the city of Jerusalem. I think it is a symbol of the heart and soul of Judeo-Christian religions, and it tells the universal story of the magical survival of an ancient people and our resilient culture. The study of the Dead Sea Scrolls is flourishing more than ever. Technological advances are allowing us to penetrate deeper into the scrolls' stories, now into the information held not only by words, but by the material of the scroll itself, exposing more and more layers of meaning. Our budding conservation research unit, the Shrine of the Book Research Center, guided by expert conservator Chassia Rimon, has developed beautifully in the past year and now regrettably closed and awaiting its return to action when we reopen our doors, hopefully very soon, as we all know. Tonight is our 9th live salon. Before we begin, I want to take advantage of the opportunity to thank a few wonderful people. Many thanks go to the staff of the museum. Special thanks to Dima and Arik and Menachem, who accompanied us throughout the series of live salons and are making sure we enjoy a wonderfully smooth experience. Thank you to Chaim Gittler, Tamar and Teddy Kolek, Chief Curator of Archaeology. Thanks to Liat Ben-Zgida for the efficient production, to Director of International Relations, Rachel Shaul, Rachel, and of course to Adolfo Roitman. Thank you very much, Adolfo. And thanks to all of you. Due to popular demand, we will be continuing with a new program of live salons, so stay tuned for the summer program, which we will soon publish. I remind you to write your questions during Adolfo's presentation using the chat box, or live and directly when we open the microphones at the end of the presentation. We're looking forward to receiving your questions. Tonight, we have the unique opportunity to revisit the importance of the city and the desert in the formulation of our culture. And Adolfo is the perfect host to guide us on this unique journey, the journey from Qumran to Jerusalem. So without further delays, Adolfo, please, the shrine is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Ido. Shalom to everybody here from Jerusalem, from the Shrine of the Book. And it's a privilege to take part of this event, a series of lectures. And I try to present a short introduction on the history of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and eventually to express, try to argue why the Dead Sea Scrolls became the most important archaeological treasure in the history of the nation, and maybe most of the significant in the history of worldwide archaeology. So let's start with the presentation. Okay, that's it. Okay, so as you see the title of the presentation, From Qumran to Jerusalem, the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls for Judaism and Christianity. The beginning of this story is in this area of the Dead Sea, actually the place called Qumran. Qumran, as you can see, it's located 40 kilometers east from Jerusalem on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. Even the Israelis, they don't know that the name Qumran, it's not the original name of the place. We know from travelers from the 19th century that they started hearing from the Bedouins the name Qumran, Gumran. So we actually say a new name. we don't know how the place was called in ancient Judaism. Some scholars argue that it could be that it's the city of the salt mentioned in the book of Joshua, chapter 15, or even the name Sechacha that also is mentioned in the book of Joshua and even in one of the scrolls. In any case, the story of the scrolls started maybe by the summer of 46 or the beginning of 47 in a cave that today it's called Cave 1. Cave 1 is located 1 kilometer north to Khirbet Qumran, and the story goes the following. The Bedouins argue that just by chance, when they got into the cave, they discovered 10 jars like these ones that today they are on display at the front of the book. The story is that according to the Bedouins version, that 8 jars were empty. 1 jar was full with something that it looked like earth. And in one of the jars, they discovered 3 scrolls. And afterwards, they again returned to the cave and they discovered 4 more scrolls. So in total, the first scrolls are the first 7 scrolls discovered by Bedouins that just by chance are the most well preserved and most complete that the scrolls ever discovered. Usually, people call this jar, the long one, the scroll jar, but according to scholars, it could be that the short one, the small one, was actually the jar in which the first scrolls were discovered. Now, what do we mean by these magical words, Dead Sea Scrolls? What actually the Bedouins discovered? So, out of the first 7 scrolls discovered by Bedouins, 2 were biblical manuscripts. And one of them, manuscript A, the most famous one, the Great Isaiah Scroll. The Great Isaiah Scroll is a full copy of the book of Isaiah, the great prophet of Israel. This manuscript is a very large manuscript, actually the second largest scroll ever discovered in the world. It has more than 7 meters of a running scroll, obviously written in Hebrew, containing all the 66 chapters of the book of Isaiah as the book of Isaiah we have in our modern Bibles. Now, if some of you are able to read Hebrew, you can read and see how the script looks like. Thanks to this scroll, we know how Hebrew was written in time of the Maccabeans. There is a science called paleography, the study of the ancient script. And paleographers, based on the script, they are able to date a manuscript. So this manuscript is dated to 120, 100 BCE, a very, very ancient manuscript. And maybe that for some of you, even if you read Hebrew, it looks like Rashi's script in modern Sefer Torah. However, for example, you can see what is written here. You see, it's written Jerusalem. It's a very readable text. So it's written in Hebrew. And again, the text is the book of Isaiah, not identical to the Masoretic traditional version we have in our hands today. However, it is very close to the version we have in our modern Bibles. By the way, even though we call this manuscript a biblical manuscript, in some way it's an anachronism, the way how we call this manuscript, because in those years, I mean by the end of the Greco-Roman times or Second Temple Judaism, Jews didn't have a Bible. So the Bible became a sacred collection of sacred books only from the 1st century on. So between the 1st and 3rd century CE, not before. But in any case, this book was a sacred book for the Jews. So, as mentioned, 2 copies of the book of Isaiah, 1 a full copy. What else discovered the Bedouins? They discovered this one, the Genesis Apocryphon. The Genesis Apocryphon, was opened only in 56 and published by the late great Hebrew University professor Yadin Vavigat in 56, and they called this manuscript Genesis Apocryphon. It's written in Aramaic, and this book, it's quite unique. Why? Because it's not the book of Genesis as we have in our modern Bibles, as the first book of the Torah. This is a rewritten version of the story of the patriarchs we have in our book of Genesis. This specific manuscript covers from chapter 5 through chapter 15 in the book of Genesis. And it has not only the version of stories on the patriarch we have in the Torah, but also some apocryphal, legendary materials that actually we didn't know about the prophets, but Jews in Second Temple times, they knew about them. By the way, this is the only copy of this book on earth. So this book, we suppose, was known by Jews in Second Temple times, but only thanks to the discovery of the scrolls, this manuscript now is known to us. And what else discovered the Bedouins? They discovered also 4 more scrolls that we modern scholars, we call them sectarian scrolls, like this one, the Pesher Habakkuk, or the commentary of the book of Habakkuk. Now, this is not the book of Habakkuk we have in our modern Bibles. The real prophet lived in the land of Israel 2,600 years ago before the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians. But this is not the book of Habakkuk. This is a very ancient interpretation of the book of Habakkuk, written in Hebrew, coming from Roman times, from the second half of the century BCE. And again, this manuscript is the only known manuscript of this book on earth. And why we call this manuscript a sectarian manuscript? Because on the basis of the theology, terminology, and sociology of this book, it's very quite obvious that this book was not known by other Jews in Second Temple times, but only by members of these people that we usually we call them the Yachat, or the Qumran community behind the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, what happened with these scrolls discovered by Bedouin? Obviously, the Bedouins had no idea about the significance, the archaeological, literary, theological significance of this manuscript. So after a couple of months, they decided to sell this manuscript to 2 antiquarian dealers from Bethlehem in South Jerusalem. And one of these dealers, an Armenian one, he sold 3 of the manuscript to this guy, Professor Eliezer Sukenik, one of the first Zionist archaeologists who worked here in the land of Israel. He was professor of the Hebrew University and one of the founders of the Institute of Archaeology of the Hebrew University. And the incredible story is that Professor Sukenik, he bought 2 out of the 3 scrolls on behalf of the Hebrew University on November 29, 47, exactly the same day on which the United Nations voted for the partition of Palestine. And what about the other scrolls, the other 4 scrolls? As part of this drama, the other scrolls were sold to this guy, the Metropolitan Athanasius Yeshua Samuel. Yeshua Samuel was the head of the Syrian church in East Jerusalem, and in those years he ran the St. Mark Monastery in East Jerusalem. And what is incredible in this story is how much he paid for these scrolls. He paid the equivalent of $100 for today. So $25 for each scrolls, as you can guess, was an incredible good deal, okay? But in comparison to Professor Sukenik, who was a scholar, who actually was the first who published a first review of the scrolls in 48, published by the Hebrew University, the Metropolitan had no idea about the content and significance of these scrolls. So actually he brought these scrolls in February 48 to the American School of Archaeology. Today it's called the Albright Institute, located still today in East Jerusalem. And he met the guy you see on the image, Dr. John Trevor. John Trevor, he was doing his postdoc from Yale University. He was the deputy director of the institute. And as you can see, when he showed the manuscript, obviously the Americans were astonished. Immediately, the Americans recognized the tremendous significance of this manuscript. And some images were sent to the great American archaeologists of those days, Professor William Foxwell Albright. He was teaching at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, and he coined the discovery, the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. So the Americans suggested to Metropolitan Athanasius Samuels to take the manuscript out from the country. We are in 48, the War of Independence broke off. So by the end of 48, Athanasius Samuel smuggled the manuscript from Jerusalem through Beirut to the States. But now, when he recognized the tremendous significance this manuscript had, he thought, why not to put them on sale? Now try to figure out how you put on sale the manuscript. So what the Athanasius Samuel decided was to put them on display, and in this way actually to show people this manuscript. The first time the manuscript were on display in history was at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., at the Oriental Studies in Chicago, and see this image that actually I brought from the archives from Duke University in North Carolina. The scrolls were on display at Duke in 1950. And where? At the church. You see the cross, you see the scrolls, and this is the altar. So try to figure out what actually the people they thought when they saw this manuscript. The owner of the manuscript was a priest. The scrolls were on display at the church, and the scrolls came from the time of Jesus. So that's the reason why right from the beginning, not only Jews and scholars, but also non-Jews, they fell in love with the Dead Sea Scrolls, because the dream and expectation was that the scrolls maybe will have some information concerning John the Baptist, Jesus, and Paul. However, the problem was, you remember how much he paid? He paid $100. Now he wanted $1 million. It was quite hard to get $1 million for the scrolls. So see, he didn't succeed in selling the scrolls, so he decided to put the scrolls in a safe box for better times. Now we go back to the land of Israel. Now we are in 49. After the independence war, the area of Samaria and Judea remained controlled by the Jordanians. And this was the political situation of the territories, still called the territories, till June 67 with the Six-Day War. So the Jordanians, when they heard about the discovery of scrolls in the area of Judea, they were in touch with this great biblical scholar and archaeologist, the Father Roland Devaux. He was the director of the French School of Archaeology, the École Biblique, still today located in East Jerusalem. And Devaux, he is going to play a key role in our drama. Between 51 and 56, Devaux excavated Khirbet Qumran, the ruins of Qumran. These ruins are located just 1 kilometer south to cave 1, and he reached the conclusion that a community lived in Qumran, and he added a community of Essenes that we know about this group as one of the 3 sects mentioned by Josephus Flavius, by Philo of Alexandria, and even Pliny the Elder, a Roman geographer from the second half of the century CE. Now, they've all reached the conclusion, if in a cave so many scrolls were discovered, and taking into account the fact that there are so many caves in the area of the Dead Sea, why not to think about the possibility that there are some other caves containing scrolls? The problem was that also the Bedouins reached the same conclusion. And then an undeclared race started between archaeologists and Bedouins, who is going to be the first to discover more scrolls. So here in this photo, you can see where is located Qumran, and you can see the other caves discovered by Bedouins or archaeologists: Cave 1, Cave 2, Cave 11, Cave 3. Now, I just want to bring as an example this special and unique cave, Cave 4. You see, Cave 4 is very close to the buildings. There is no way to reach Cave 4 if you don't get through the buildings. Now, in this close-up of the entrance of Cave 4 is the richest cave discovered, in this case by the Bedouins. By the way, the best caves were discovered by Bedouins: Cave 1, Cave 4, and Cave 11. Only in this cave were discovered 15,000 fragments of manuscript. Again, I repeat, and it's not a mistake, not 15,000 manuscript, 15,000 fragments of manuscript. And what we mean by fragments of manuscript? For example, this one. This is an Aramaic fragment from the Book of Enoch from Cave 4, a very important manuscript written in Aramaic. The Book of Enoch was known in Western civilization before the discovery of the scrolls, but in a complete version in classical Ethiopic, in Ge'ez. And now, thanks to the Dead Sea Scroll, Aramaic fragments, some of them coming from 3rd century BCE, 250 BCE, were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls. What else were discovered in Qumran? For example, this biblical scroll in Greek. Most of the Dead Sea Scrolls are written on animal skin, on ancient parchment, like our Sefer Torah, and a few, around 20% on papyrus. So this is a papyrus. 4, the number is K4, Q is Qumran, 70 in Roman is the Septuagint version, the first Jewish translation of the scriptures made by Jews in Alexandria between the 3rd through 1st century BCE, from the book of Leviticus, LV Leviticus, Vaikra in Hebrew, manuscript A. And you see the manuscript is very famous, not only because of its content, but also because of its shape. It looks like the state of Israel. Now, there is a very unique manuscript from Cave 3 called Copper Scroll, because it's engraved on copper. What you see in this image are 2 fragments of the same manuscript. It's a unique document, like this one in copper. By then, the archaeologists and scholars had no idea how to unroll this manuscript. So after 3 years, it was decided to bring it to the University of Manchester. And you see the manuscript was cut into slices, like this one. You can see a close-up of the manuscript. And today, the original copper scroll, it's not here in Israel, it's in Jordan at the Archaeological Museum in Amman. So we miss this manuscript. And the manuscript is very unique. It's written in Hebrew, in late Hebrew, from the end of 1st century CE or beginning of 2nd century CE. And what is incredible is the content. The manuscript tells about 64 places in which treasures of gold and silver were buried in the Judean desert. So you see, it's a real Indiana Jones story. So the bottom line, between 47 and 56, in 11 caves in the area of Qumran, more or less 25,000 fragments of manuscript were discovered. And once these manuscripts were reconstructed, today we have in hands more or less 1,000 manuscripts coming from 2,000 years ago. 90% of the manuscripts written in Hebrew, and a few in Aramaic and Greek. Obviously, I have no time here, at least today, to get through all these 1,000 manuscripts. But in order to give you an idea, the results of this research, all the fragments were brought in those years to the Rockefeller Archaeological Museum in East Jerusalem, built in time of the British Mandate. And then all the manuscripts, the fragments were brought to the room was called the scrollery, and see how the scholars, they managed to build what actually some scholars called the largest jigsaw in the history of human mankind, to put together all the pieces. And as I mentioned, the result is that today we have about 1,000 manuscripts, very few in a very good shape, most of them very fragmentary materials. But what is actually the result? What we have in hands? This is what we have in hands. 25% of these scrolls are biblical manuscripts. And in a few moments, I am going to deal a bit to talk about this topic. So 25% is a lot, is a quarter of all the manuscripts are the biblical manuscripts, the most ancient biblical manuscript on earth. What else? We have also 250 common Judaism scrolls. In some cases, some books known before the discovery of the scrolls. In other cases, unknown manuscript. And we have a full range of literary genres. We have liturgical material, magical material, astronomical material, apocalyptic material. So the Dead Sea Scrolls open a new window to literature unknown and practices and Jewish thought unknown before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And 37%, that's a lot, of what we call the sectarian scrolls. So materials preserved, studied, and copied by people who belong to a group or a movement, people who saw themselves the chosen people of God, people who segregated themselves from mainstream Judaism. Now, you remember when I mentioned the first scrolls discovered by Bedouins? Actually, by then, they didn't know that the first scrolls discovered by Bedouins represented these three basic categories: the Isaiah scroll to the biblical scroll, Genesis Apocrypha to the common Judaism scrolls, and Pesher Habakkuk to the sectarian scrolls. Now, being the case that obviously most people, they know and ask questions about the biblical manuscript, I just want to show you what actually it was discovered. We have among the biblical materials copies of all the biblical books except for the book of Esther and the book of Nehemiah. We don't have copies among the scrolls, and some others are very popular. You see 36 copies of the book of Psalms, 30 copies of the book of Deuteronomy, 20 copies of Genesis, and 21st copies of Isaiah. Now, why it's very significant, this part? Just one example. See, these are the biblical quotations in the New Testament. So which are the biblical books from the Hebrew Bible mentioned in the New Testament? And see the correlation, the incredible correlation. The most popular biblical books in the New Testament are Psalms, Isaiah, and Deuteronomy, exactly the same phenomenon that we have among the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it means that thanks to the Dead Sea Scrolls, we can see that what we have in the New Testament literature, it's not in a late development made by late Christian scribes, but actually it's a very ancient Jewish tradition, now known thanks to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, as part of this drama, Now I return to 54. So on June the 1st, 54, see what happened. Athanasius Samuel put an ad on the Wall Street Journal announcing that there are 4 Dead Sea Scrolls on display. Biblical manuscripts dating to at least 200 BC are for sale. This will be an ideal gift to an educational or religious institution by an individual or group. That's an incredible story. Could you figure out that you are going to open a newspaper and to find out an ad offering the Dead Sea Scrolls on sale? And just as part of the incredible drama, who was in Washington on that precise day? Professor Yigael Yadin. When he read this ad, he remembered what his father had told him, that he had missed in Jerusalem 4 scrolls. I mean the Athanasius scroll. So then what happened is that Yigael Yadin, through a third guy that is going to be Professor Harry Orlinsky, he bought these 4 scrolls. He didn't pay $1 million, he paid $250,000. $150,000 were given as a gift to the state of Israel by Samuel Gottesman, and $100,000 were given as a loan by the government of Israel. These 4 scrolls were brought back to Israel, and for the first time ever, the Dead Sea Scrolls were on display in Passover 55 at Terra Santa building, temporarily housing the Hebrew University, and was what we call in museology a non-permanent exhibition. You can see the then president of the state of Israel, Yitzhak Ben-Zvi. And when the scrolls started being on display in a permanent exhibition, only from 57 on at the Hebrew University Givat Ramp campus, and here you can see the first curator of this exhibition was Professor Yigael Yadin. Here he's guiding and showing the scrolls to these distinguished visitors. And they decided then that a new building must be built for this incredible manuscript. And this is the beginning of the story of our institution, the Shrine of the Book. In the early 60s, Frederick Kissler and Armand Bartos, they were responsible for the construction of the Shrine of the Book, this marvelous building here as part of the Israel Museum campus. The Shrine of the Book was built between 1960 and 64, and the Shrine of the Book was dedicated on April 2065. Even the Israelis, they don't know that actually was the first gallery of the Israel Museum open to the general public. And since then, the white dome and the black wall became a real icon, not just of the Israel Museum or the city of Jerusalem, but actually of the cultural life of the state of Israel worldwide. The tension between colors, they speak and show about the tension we have in the scrolls between the son of light, the son of darkness, between the chosen people of God and their enemies. So the architects, they wanted very much to stress this religious tension in the scrolls through architecture. And then when you reach this room, actually the room that I am sitting right now, this is like in the Temple of Jerusalem is the Holy of Holies. The most important archaeological treasure of the Jewish nation on earth are on display here at the Shrine of the Book. And this is the reason also why people from all over the world, when they visit Israel, I mean presidents, kings, they come to visit us. Right this year, last January, I hosted Prince Charles here at the Shrine of the Book in January, before obviously the Corona. So for the last half an hour, I tried to summarize in this very short presentation the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But I think the best way to bring to an end this presentation is just to give the word to maybe the most prominent archaeologist in the history of the state of Israel, Yigael Yadin, who in a very traditional book called The Meaning of the Dead Sea Scrolls, he explained to us why the Dead Sea Scrolls are so significant. And that's what Professor Yadin said. I cannot avoid the feeling that there is something symbolic in the discovery of the scrolls and the reacquisition at the moment of the creation of the state of Israel. It is as if this manuscript had been waiting in cave for 2,000 years, ever since the destruction of Israel's independence, and that the people of Israel had returned to their home and regained their freedom. The symbolism is heightened by the fact that the first 3 scrolls were bought by my father for Israel on November 29, 47, the very day on which the United Nations voted for the recreation of the Jewish state in Israel after 2,000 years. These facts may have influenced my approach to the scrolls. It was a tremendous, exciting experience, difficult to convey in words, to see the original scrolls and to study them, knowing that some of the biblical manuscripts were copied only a few hundred years after their composition, and that these very scrolls were read and studied by our forefathers in the period of the Second Temple. They constitute a vital link, long lost and now regained, between those ancient times so rich in civilized thought and the present day. And just as a Christian reader must be moved by the knowledge that here he has a manuscript of a sect whom the early Christian may have known and by whom they may have been influenced, so an Israeli and a Jew can find nothing more deeply moving than the study of manuscript written by the people of the book in the land of the book more than 2,000 years ago. And today we have the privilege of having this marvelous, incredible discovery here on display at the shrine of the book. Thank you, and God bless you. That's it.
Thank you very much, Adolfo. Thank you. It's beautiful. Thank you very much. And now we'd be very, very happy to have some questions, whether by chat or people can open their microphones and ask freely, speak directly to Adolfo. And I see that Elliot Safra is writing, do you have any ideas why the scrolls were inside the caves? Were they stored there purposely for future generations to discover, or simply there because the people used to read them in the caves? Okay. So I think this is a wonderful question.
Yes, the problem is with the, thank you for the question. The problem is the answer. As you can guess, many suggestions were given. I would say the following. Right at the beginning of the research, scholars argued that once the Qumran community, they heard of the news that the Romans are approaching Qumran, so they decided to hide the scrolls in the caves in order to rescue the caves, and they hope that by the end of the revolt, they will be able to retrieve the scrolls from the cave. So this was actually the beginning of the research, and they argued that also, or they assumed that all the scrolls were part of the, what Professor Frank Cross in a classical book called The Ancient Library of Qumran, that all these manuscripts came from Qumran and were produced in Qumran. Today, actually, the whole picture changed. Some scholars argue that there are some caves that maybe the scrolls are coming from the community. For example, cave 1, cave 4, cave 5, cave 6. And this is, and one of the main arguments is that the sectarian materials are in these caves. So therefore we can find out a correlation between the content of the scrolls and the fact that these caves are very close to the buildings. However, there are some other cases with materials that we are not so sure that they belong to the community. And in recent papers, scholars advanced the possibility that many of the scrolls were brought from elsewhere, maybe from Jerusalem, from other places, by other people and not by the Qumran communities. For example, the materials from Cave 11 or Cave 3, they assume that actually they were brought from other groups, maybe by rebels who fled away from Jerusalem in time of the revolt against the Romans. Or for example, if cave 7 through cave 10, the scrolls, they look very different. First of all, very few written materials. Cave 7, all the scrolls are written in Greek. That's very unusual. I mentioned that most of the materials are written in Hebrew. So today, I would say all the time we are reviewing ourselves. In this sense, new hypotheses are being argued by scholars in order to answer still a very hot question.
Yeah. So we have a number of we have a few very interesting questions. Alan Alter is asking, from the, or of the 1,000 or so scrolls and fragments, how many are in Israel and where are others besides in Jordan? So what is really, how have the scrolls or the fragments dispersed around the globe?
Okay, so first, most of the Dead Sea Scrolls are in Israeli hands. There are two institutions in Israel holding scrolls. We at the Israel Museum, at the Edition of the Book, we have only 8 scrolls, but our only 8 scrolls are the most well preserved and most complete Dead Sea Scrolls on earth. So our scrolls are 25% of all the scrolls on earth. Like for example, the Isaiah scroll, we have the largest scroll ever discovered, Temple Scroll. Temple Scroll arrived in the Israel Museum in after the Sixth War, and is part of our collection. Then most of the thousands of fragments here in Israel are held by the Israel Antiquities Authorities. And outside Israel, there are some institutions arguing that they have Dead Sea Scroll fragments, like for example, the famous story with the Dead Sea Scroll fragments in possession of the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., that actually resulted to be fake. We know about 300 very tiny Dead Sea Scroll fragment owned by the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. We know about private collectors like Martin Schoyen in Oslo, also having his personal collection fragments, but most of the fragments are here in Israel. And why the Jordanians, they hold scrolls? Because I remind you the fact that till June 67, the territories were controlled by the Jordanians. So, and just by chance, on June 7, 67, when the Israeli forces reached Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem, some scrolls were in Jordan on that day, and one of these scrolls was the Temple Scroll, the Copper Scroll, and that's the reason why today is in possession of the Jordanians in Jordan.
Okay, there's a number of questions that I'll try to sort of consolidate. They have to do with new technologies, the computer methods that are applied to reconstruct and reassemble the fragments. This is by David Josephy. And also Tamara is asking if you could address the significance of the DNA discoveries. I think you related to that when you mentioned the differences between the scrolls, but maybe you want to elaborate a little bit. So maybe a few words about the technological advances and what they teach us, what we're seeing these days.
Yes. Okay, so I tell the following. So traditionally, who were the scholars working on Dead Sea Scrolls? Obviously, biblical scholars, philologists, historians, archaeologists, people whose expertise was actually in literature and ancient Jewish literature. But in the last years, we see more and more that new technologies starting being involved in Dead Sea Scrolls research. I want just to put on the table 3 of them. One, for example, photography. So today, scholars, they make use of new technologies in order to improve the readings of the scrolls. For example, right at the beginning, the most sophisticated technology was the infrared. But today, we use multispectral images that I tell you, it's like a dream. So you look at the manuscript, it looks empty, nothing written there. And then using this technology, you start seeing letters. Letters that were there, but actually using your naked eye, it was impossible to read, even using infrared. So actually photography, that is one of them. The second one is the study, for example, of the ink. So how happened that today scholars, they know that all the 16 fragments of scrolls in possession of the Green Foundation are fake. Obviously, when they decided to buy this manuscript, they took advice with scholars, and they advise that they look originals, because actually the material looks very ancient. Also, they studied the content. Maybe I assume that also they took samples and they were dated using carbon 14 dating. But what happened is, using new technologies, when new samples of this manuscript were sent to Berlin, they studied the chemical components of the ink. And then scholars in Berlin, they reached the conclusion that the ink contains modern chemical materials that were unknown in antiquity. So again, thanks to new technologies, we are able today to argue which manuscripts are originals and which are not. And the third, maybe also what you heard on the news, is the DNA studies. Just a recent paper published by several scholars, one of them a very good friend of mine, Professor Noam Mizrahi from Tel Aviv University, that using this new technique is possible to know if the way how these fragments and the manuscript were reconstructed in the past, the fragments that they put together, they belong to the same parchment. And they reached the conclusion that in one of the cases was a fragment of the book of Jeremiah, in one of the scrolls, that actually was the wrong piece. It didn't belong to the fragment. Or, for example, also they reached the conclusion that the copy of Song of the Sabbath Sacrifice from Masada, that Professor Yadin, when he discovered this manuscript in the excavation in 63, 65, he argued that it could have been brought from Qumran, and today it's very clear that it doesn't come from Qumran, because the genomic components of this manuscript is different from the DNA from the other copies of this manuscript from Qumran. So it's quite obvious that this manuscript doesn't come from Qumran. So in this way, new technologies help modern scholars to not just resolve ancient questions, actually they pose new questions for the coming generation of scholars.
Wonderful. We have a question from Phil Burton, wondering whether the copper scroll in Amman has been copied and translated.
Sorry, the copper scroll?
The copper scroll from Amman, has it been copied and translated?
Yes. If some of the participants of this event now, you say, wait a minute, I didn't know that the Dead Sea Scrolls are so interesting. We would love to read more about that. So the non-biblical materials, all of them were translated in modern languages. Very good English translation, like Professor Geza Vermesh from Oxford, or for example, Professor Garcia Martinez. So very good translations you have in Spanish, in Italian, in French. So today there are no excuse. Even if you don't read Hebrew or Aramaic, people can read about the scrolls and know these contents. Yes. That's it?
sorry, yeah. Do the scrolls compare closely to today's version of the same books? Are there any changes in actual words or meanings?
He means the biblical text.
Yeah, how I imagine, but Sam,
Okay,
maybe you want to,
yes, okay.
clarify.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I will say the following. Obviously, one of the most exciting questions concerning the biblical scrolls is how close the biblical scrolls are to the scrolls we have today. I mean the Hebrew Bible we have today in hands. So on one side, we have between 40 to 60% of the Dead Sea Scrolls, I mean the biblical Dead Sea Scrolls, that we say that they have a proto-Masoretic version. In other words, they have a version of the biblical tradition very close to the materials we have today in our hands. However, there are some other scrolls that they have what we call variant readings. So sometimes differences between letters, words, and full sentences. And this is obviously very significant for scholarship, because in biblical studies, even one letter makes the whole difference. So therefore, before we start asking theological, historical, literary question about the biblical tradition, we have to establish which is the text. So the Dead Sea Scrolls give us a new perspective about the biblical tradition, and what we know, and this is the bottom line, in comparison to our present situation, when you come to the synagogue and they are reading the Torah, you don't ask from which edition they are reading, because you know it doesn't matter where, in LA, in Washington, in Buenos Aires, in Rio de Janeiro, or in Jerusalem, always we read from the same Sefer Torah. Now, in Second Temple Judaism, in Greco-Roman times, Jews, they read from different versions. Sometimes, if you compare them, a bit different between them, but still for them, the text was a sacred text. So it means the situation that we have today, that you don't introduce any change into the text, and always you preserve the same version, what we call the canonical version. This is a situation that only happened after the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans, and when actually the Masoretic version became the definitive version by the end of the first millennium. In some way, this is a new situation that is different from the situation of the biblical tradition before the destruction of the temple by the Romans.
Yeah. Okay. There's a question from Nira regarding the Christian connection concerning the scroll. So I imagine, yeah, the connection to Christianity, I imagine.
Yes. You know, my feeling is that each question is a new seminar.
Is a whole, yeah, exactly.
Okay, I would say the following. You remember that when I said that the scrolls were discovered, the expectation was that the scrolls will shed light on the origin of the church. So the natural expectation was the scrolls will make mention of John the Baptist, Jesus, Paul, and the fact is they are unmentioned. Most of the scrolls are coming from the 2nd, 1st century BCE. We have scrolls from the 1st century CE, but John the Baptist and Jesus, they disappear by the 30 of the 1st century, and the end of the Qumran community was by the middle of 1st century CE. So we have no time in order that the scrolls will refer to all these figures. However, even though the scrolls don't mention all these major characters in the history of human mankind, still the Dead Sea Scrolls are crucial for the study of the early church. First, because the first Christians were also Jews. So obviously what is relevant for Jews is relevant for the first Christian. Jesus, John, and Paul didn't know they were Christians. They were Jews, were born as Jews, lived as Jews, and died as Jews. And today, there is no way to study about the first Christians. We you don't make use of the scrolls, because the scrolls are relevant for the practice, for the thought, for the literature of Jews in Second Temple Judaism. So in this sense, the Dead Sea Scrolls became a key, not just for the study of Judaism, but also for the study of Christianity.
Okay, I think you dealt very well with this huge question. Thank you. There's a nice question by Steve Goldman, which really goes to another dimension of the scrolls. He's asking about the aesthetic qualities of the scrolls, and I think specifically about the calligraphy in the scrolls.
The paleography?
Calligraphy.
Ah, the calligraphy, yes. Yeah. Okay, so scholars who are experts in ancient script are able to identify specific scribes. It sounds very mysterious. So we know who are the scribes, not because we know the identity, but because we recognize the script of these scribes. So therefore, scholars are able to trace after the scribe that the same guy who copied one manuscript, we know that it's the same guy who copied another manuscript. So therefore, we can correlate if there is some connection between the contents, between the dating of the manuscript. So in this sense, the Dead Sea Scrolls give us a chance also to understand the artistry of writing in Second Temple Judaism. And this is an incredible contribution to scholarship, because today we know that some practices that became traditional in Judaism, for example, we have the Sofer Stam, and we know how a Sefer Torah is produced today, in some way is the same practice that also scribes 2,000 years ago, how they used to write and to produce books. So in this way, calligraphy, the script, is also part of the history of Judaism.
Wonderful. Abe Sofer is asking about the research at the museum. So what we are actually doing, and what type of research we're doing in the laboratory at the museum.
Okay, so now, as mentioned by Ido, today, in these very days, we are setting up a new research lab here at the Israel Museum, and for many reasons. First, because as a curator, myself and Hagit Maoz, that we are together at the Shrine, we are responsible for the collection. We have a lot of questions that people till today, they don't know a real answer. I tell you something that maybe you take it for granted. For how long I can put on display a scroll? This is a crucial question. A month, 2 months, 3 months. Usually there is a tradition only 3 months, but we don't know why. This is just a tradition, okay? So why? This is very crucial for our work as curators. Or for example, the amount of light, which kind of light, in which position and position we can show the scrolls. So there are a lot of questions beyond scholarship that are crucial for our work here at the Israel Museum. Or for example, the monitoring of scrolls. For, you know, when you check the scroll, you look at the scrolls, you say, okay, it looks nice. What do you mean? How we can be sure that the scrolls are in a good state of preservation? If there is any change, that maybe when you look at the scrolls using your eyes, you can pay attention to some very tiny changes that are going to be very significant in a few years from today. So the only way is we have to trace after the development and the physical preservation of the scrolls. For this reason also, we have new and very sophisticated technologies that maybe we are going to be the first that we using all these technologies and all the time in order to preserve the scrolls for the coming generations. Now, you want a joke? By the way, it's not a joke. Many years ago, I was discussing with a member of our labs, Michael Magen. He's the director of the paper conservation department here at the museum, and we were discussing about the preservation of Dead Sea Scrolls. And he asked me, Adolfo, really you want to preserve the scroll for the coming generation? I said, sure, Michael. So bring them back to the caves, okay? So therefore, all the time we are asking more and more questions about how it should be done. And therefore, in this sense, I think it's a great blessing that here at the Israel Museum, we are setting up this lab, but obviously we'll need the support of many, many people, because it's a real great challenge, but it's going to be for the benefit of the scrolls and for the Jewish culture.
Thank you very much. There's maybe we'll take one or two
I
more
feel,
questions.
Dido, I feel as in a press conference.
Well, it is actually, and you really are in charge of something very important. So it is this way like a press conference. There's a nice question by Miriam Tawil asking about how the Bedouins, probably the Bedouins who found the scrolls, how did they interpret them? What do they think about them?
So what happened is that at the beginning, obviously they had no idea about the significance of the scrolls, and that's the reason just for a few coins, they sold the scrolls to the antiquarian dealers. Only when the archaeologists started looking for more scrolls, they realized that the scrolls have a tremendous significance. And that's the reason why I mentioned the fact that they started searching for new caves with scrolls, and by chance or not, obviously because they know the area, the best caves were discovered by Bedouins. Cave 1 and Cave 11, because inside, in these caves, the best scrolls were discovered. I remind you, the first 7 scrolls are coming from Cave 1, and these are the scrolls as part of my collection. And my collection is Israel Museum and the State of Israel collection. And the Temple Scroll is coming from Cave 11. And Cave 4 is the richest cave, if you remember I mentioned. And also something that I didn't mention, but now I think that is also significant. Qumran is the most significant place, but it's not the only place in the Judean desert where Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. North to Qumran in Wadi Dalia, south to Qumran in Masada, in Nahal Hever, Wadi Murabat, Nahal Tselim. Also some other caves with manuscript were discovered. However, Qumran is unique due to the amount of material, the quality of material, the state of preservation of material, the variety of material. Qumran really is unique, and this is the reason why still Qumran is at the heart of all this scholarly discussion.
Wonderful. There's 2 questions I'll put together. Both of them relate to the protection of the scrolls. You related to that before, but I think maybe one, David Joseph is mentioning that it's shocking to see how people handle the scrolls without gloves and even with a cigarette in their mouth. I think that was on purpose that you put that specific photo. And but I think it's also an explanation of how the research dedicated to preservation is advancing all the time. We're learning more and more things.
Exactly.
The second question relates to the question of what will happen if we have a terrorist attack or a rocket attack. How are the scrolls protected in that case?
Okay, so that's incredible that you are asking me this question, because just yesterday we had a Zoom meeting with members from security, with the chief curator of archaeology, with other members of our staff, with Hasia, with Hagit, with Sharon, the director of the labs, discussing exactly about all the, it's not just the corona, it's a earthquake, war, fire. So, you know, we try to do our best, a lot of effort, a lot of effort and a lot of thought we are putting on all this issue. For example, many years ago, we built a safe room for the scrolls that they are not on exhibit. Obviously, not all the scrolls are on display. As all the museums, we have some materials on display. All the scrolls on display here at the front of the book are original scrolls, except for the Isaiah scroll. What you see here is just a facsimile, but in 65, when the front of the book was open to the public, the original Isaiah scroll was on display. Then for conservation reasons, the original one was taken out from display, but always a fragment of the original is on display at one of these showcases. And all the other scrolls, the original scrolls that are not on display, are held in the safe room. Just to give you an idea, this room looks like the Prime Minister bunker. Obviously, is the most important treasure of the Jewish nation on earth. And by the way, very few people are allowed to get into the room. Even Ido is not allowed to get into the room. So you have a code. Always I tell people it's much easier to get into the Pentagon than to get into the safe room holding the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the bottom line, we do our best in order to make sure that in any catastrophe, the scrolls will be at safe.
Okay, I think this will be enough for tonight. We'll leave a few questions for people who will be coming to visit you at the museum, hopefully soon. And we are really waiting for this moment when we can reopen. I thank everybody who's been with us tonight, and yeah, stay tuned. We will be publishing some more salon talks soon. And stay safe. Yeah, thank you very much.
It was my pleasure, and thank you to everybody. Okay, Shabbat Shalom from Jerusalem.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm going to share, there was a question about the recording of the salon talk. I'll say that we regularly upload the talks to our website. I'll share it in a couple of seconds. I'll share it on the chat, and you can go there and see the previous salon talks that we had. And this one, after we edit it a little bit, just very cosmetically, we'll upload it probably in about a week's time, something like that, and you can enjoy it there. But I'll put the website address for you.